What if I told you the reason they never caught the Zodiac Killer is because there is no Zodiac Killer, but a group of Zodiac Killers? A bunch of individuals killing under the Zodiac brand. San Francisco, October 11th, 1969. It was a foggy day. At the intersection of Washington and Cherry, yellow cab driver Paul Stine was bleeding out from a point-blank 9mm gunshot wound to the right side of his head. The killer was in the front passenger seat. He reached over the dying man, cut a large rectangular patch off of Stine's blood-soaked shirt, wiped down the cab's interior to erase his fingerprints, and vanished into the night. 2 days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received a letter containing the same bloody fabric alongside a taunting message claiming that he had done the murder. For over 50 years, that bloody shirt fragment was the anchor to the narrative of the Zodiac. It cemented the terrifying image of a single supervillain who held Northern California hostage, transitioning from shooting teenagers on rural dirt roads to executing a cab driver in the heart of a major city. The narrative paints a picture of a criminal mastermind, an expert marksman, a code-writing genius who hunted humans for sport. But when you strip away all the sensationalism, the physical evidence tells a story of a fractured, contradictory mess of ballistics, eyewitness identification impossibilities, and handwriting problems. The Zodiac Killer was not a lone wolf. The Zodiac was a network of independent killers, copycats, and a letter-writing hoaxer operating from within the investigation itself. The connections between the murders, the Lake Herman Road shootings, the Blue Rock Springs attack, and the Lake Berryessa stabbing, and the Presidio Heights murder was a series of handwritten letters mailed to Bay Area newspapers by someone using a crosshair symbol. You know the symbol. The belief that the letter writer and the killer were the same man was accepted almost immediately, mostly because of the inclusion of Paul Stine's shirt. The lone mastermind theory has been the part of various movies, books, and has been an accepted cultural truth. Many people like to point the finger at Arthur Lee Allen, yet Allen has been repeatedly cleared. His DNA did not match the saliva on the letter stamps, his fingerprints didn't match the bloody prints left on Paul Stine's cab, and forensic handwriting examiners have ruled out his handwriting. So the prime suspect matches the psychological profile of the killer, but has none of the forensic markers of the letter writer. So the question becomes, could the letters and the murders be the work of entirely different people? In 2014, researcher Thomas Henry Horan published The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, a forensic investigation proposing that the Zodiac persona was an outright fabrication. Horan argued it was a hoax designed to terrorize the public and derail local investigators by claiming credit for unrelated, unsolved murders. The 2023 Peacock docuseries Myth the Zodiac Killer brought this theory to the mainstream, exposing the glaring logistical flaws of a single person committing all of the crimes. Online sleuths have developed the triad theory that suggests that up to 3 unconnected men unknowingly contributed to a single legend, and their crimes have been hijacked by a letter writer. When the canonical crimes are looked at critically, the lone mastermind theory crumbles quickly. Serial killers evolve, but their core behavioral signatures don't go through the violent, contradictory changes that are in the Zodiac crimes. The 4 canonical attacks have wildly different methodologies. On the cold night of December 20th, 1968, high school students David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen parked Faraday's brown Rambler on a dark, remote lover's lane just outside Vallejo city limits. Someone pulled up, forced them out of the vehicle, and opened fire in the dark. The ballistics at Lake Herman Road tell a story. The weapon used was a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. This is a low-power firearm that has a lack of stopping power and a tendency to jam. And the shooter's behavior was amateur. Jensen was shot 5 times in the back as she fled. The wound pattern started at her lower back and tracked upwards and outwards in an erratic spread. This shows a shooter with no recoil control. Instead of resetting his sights after each shot, the killer simply slammed the trigger in a panic, allowing the recoil of the .22 to force the barrel higher with each consecutive shot. This is the shooting of someone who has seen how to shoot people in movies, and it contradicts the later media-driven myth that the Zodiac was a military-trained expert marksman. This was a novice that was just spraying bullets into the dark, not some sniper boogeyman. 7 months later, around midnight on July 4th, 1969, Darlene Farron and Mike were attacked in the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. The person walked up to the passenger side of the vehicle and fired through the window, blinding them with a bright flashlight. Here, the weapon changed from a .22 caliber to a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, but the attack was still sloppy. The shooter walked away, heard Majot moaning in pain, returned to the car, and fired again in a chaotic frenzy. Mageau would survive. He provided the first physical description of the killer, a stocky, heavy-set man, roughly 5'8", weighing between 195 and 200 pounds, with short, curly, light brown hair. Within an hour, a man called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone. He claimed responsibility for the Blue Rock shooting and took credit for the Faraday and Jensen shooting, saying, "I also killed those kids last year." The killer was finding his footing, attempting to build a persona, but the next attack would throw everything out the window. The events of September 27, 1969 look like they belong in a different universe from the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs shootings. At Lake Berryessa in Napa County, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking on an isolated peninsula in broad daylight. A man approached them wearing a executioner's hood. The hood was squared off at the top and draped down to his chest and had a large white crosshair symbol on it. The killer would talk extensively. His voice was described by Hartnell as a slow, steady drawl. He claimed to be an escaped convict from a Montana prison who needed a car and money to flee to Mexico. He ordered Shepard to bind Hartnell with pre-cut plastic clothesline he had brought to the scene, then bound her himself. Without warning, the robbery ruse went away. He drew a foot-long knife and viciously stabbed both victims, leaving them for dead. This crime is an outlier. It doesn't make sense for someone who was just shooting into the dark of night to suddenly become a person attacking people with knives in the middle of the daytime. The Berryessa killer left a handwritten message on the door of Hartnell's car with the dates of the Vallejo murders, the location, and the phrase, "by knife." The costume, the weapon shift to a knife, the daytime setting, and the bizarre robbery script suggests a copycat, as if it were someone who had read about the Vallejo murders, adopted the crosshair symbol, and acted out a fantasy under the umbrella of the Zodiac brand. And the physical evidence at Berryessa blows up the lone killer theory. Hartnell described a massive lumbering man standing at 5'11 to 6 and weighing between 220 and 250 pounds. And this has been corroborated by the impressions left by size 10.5 wing-walker military boots that investigators were able to calculate a heavy weight based on the depth of the tread in the dirt. This large man does not match Mike Mageau's description of a 5'8", 195-pound man with curly hair. The handwriting on the car door is cited as proof that the Zodiac committed the crime, but it has a lot of anomalies. Forensic experts point out structural differences. The killer wrote the number 6 3 different ways on the car door alone, and none of them align with the paper letters. The lowercase e on the car door looks different, and the signature flourish on the lowercase j seen in the letters is absent. What if the man in the executioner's hood was a copycat trying to forge the Zodiac's handwriting? The daylight monster faded into the Napa Hills, but the horror would mutate again, this time in San Francisco. 2 weeks after the brutal stabbings at Lake Berryessa, the killer supposedly struck again, executing Paul Stine in the affluent Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. The victims shifted from young couples in remote rural areas to a lone man in the middle of the city. The weapon was a 9mm pistol, but ballistics testing by the California Department of Justice proved it was not the same 9mm pistol used at Blue Rock Springs. If the killer's motivation was to build a brand and to prove his identity to the police, changing the gun doesn't make any sense. And the setup of the Presidio Heights murder suggests a routine cab robbery gone wrong, or a targeted hit that was hijacked by the letter writer. And the description of the killer would change again. 3 teenagers walking from a house across the street, as well as a SFPD officer named Donald Folk, provided a description that contradicted the Lake Berryessa large man. They described a man roughly 5'10", heavily built but barrel-chested, with a reddish blonde or light brown crew cut. Officer Folk said that Arthur Lee Allen was nearly 100 pounds too heavy to be the man he saw that night, and he had a completely different face shape. Now, it's obvious that a man can't change his height, his bone structure, and hair texture between July, September, and October 1969. When you look at all of the eyewitness testimony, it doesn't show a single man. It's 2, maybe even 3 distinct individuals. But what about the bloody shirt? This is the linchpin of the mastermind theory. The narrative is that the Zodiac tore a piece of Paul Stine's shirt at the crime scene and mailed it to the San Francisco Chronicle to prove he was the killer. However, there's a massive problem with that. No first responder at the Stine crime scene reported that the victim's shirt was missing a massive rectangular chunk. In the chaos of a point-blank execution, tearing a rectangular swatch of fabric from a bleeding body requires time, leverage, and something to cut the fabric with. If the shirt was intact at the crime scene, the piece mailed to the press could only have been taken after the body was transported to the morgue or entered into the evidence locker. If the shirt was cut at the morgue, then who cut it. If the physical perpetrators were different men, the genius of the Zodiac Killer lies in the letter writing campaign. The author of the letters consolidated a series of chaotic homicides into a single brand. The handwriting shows inconsistencies when you look at them more closely. The letters themselves have stylistic shifts. The December 20th, 1969 letter to attorney Melvin Belly is printed in clean handwriting, distinct from the frantic scrawl of the letter taking credit for the Paul Stine murder. The Zodiac Ciphers, or puzzles, show a mind that's obsessed with gamesmanship. The solved 408 symbol cipher and the complex 340 character cipher show intense mathematical planning. The linguistic context of the letters has all of these intentional misspellings. You spelled Christmas wrong. He spelled paradise wrong. The author was highly intelligent, possessing a deep understanding of code making, yet cloaked himself in the guise of an unhinged, semi-literate madman. The profile of a game-playing, symbol-obsessed code maker doesn't align with the terrified, sloppy, heavy-breathing assailant who sprayed bullets in the dark at Lake Herman Road, or the man who bumbled through a robbery script at Lake Berryessa. The brain writing the ciphers and the hands committing the violence appear to be different people. The letter writer had to have access to the crime scenes, the evidence, and the unreleased details of the murders. Investigative researchers have pointed towards law enforcement as the writers of the letters. Thomas Henry Porin points at Hal Snook, who was a Vallejo police evidence technician. Snook had access to all of the police reports, the crime scene photographs, and the evidence lockers. He had the exact inside knowledge that the Zodiac used in his letters to prove his identity. Some handwriting analysts have even noted that Snook's handwriting looks similar to the Zodiac's handwriting. Former Vallejo police officer Richard Hoffman, who was a first responder to the Blue Rock Springs attack, was accused by his own grandson, Jeremy Foy, of being the Zodiac. Foy alleged that Hoffman's private letters have the same misspellings, like spelling until with 2 L's, suggesting Hoffman may have been practicing the style to put himself into the story. And it's not far-fetched to think that law enforcement officers would fabricate Zodiac letters. A San Francisco homicide detective who led the Zodiac hunt, Inspector Toschi, was stripped of his position on the case in 1978 after admitting to forging fake fan letters to Chronicle writer Armistead Maupin. When a highly suspect Zodiac letter arrived the same year praising Toschi, Maupin immediately recognized the margin stops and the shape of the letters as identical to the fake fan mail Toschi had sent him. Toschi would be removed from the homicide detail, with his career damaged. If the lead investigator of the case was forging a Zodiac letter to manipulate the media, the entire letter writing campaign is compromised. It shows that the Zodiac persona was a tool used by opportunistic individuals seeking attention or fame, or to continue the sensationalized panic. The glue holding all of the crimes together is the letter writer. Perhaps an evidence technician like Hal Snook, or a rogue cop like Richard Hoffman, or even a journalist who realized the immense power of the Zodiac brand. The hoax writer, this network explains every forensic discrepancy that has plagued this case for 50 years. It explains why ballistics never matched between Vallejo and San Francisco. It explains why the physical descriptions go from a 5'8" curly-haired man to a 250-pound large man. It explains how the killer had impossible knowledge of crimes across multiple jurisdictions while having a distance from the actual violence. The human brain loves a story, and it's unsatisfying to accept that a string of brutal, senseless murders might be the work of unrelated, sloppy men. The public, the media, and even law enforcement wanted a single boogeyman. They wanted an evil genius, a supervillain, to justify the terror that gripped Northern California. The letter writer understood this vulnerability by wrapping chaotic acts of violence in the packaging of a supervillain, and it even had a catchy name, a logo, and puzzles. The writer created a monster that transcended the crimes. The evidence demands a re-examination of everything known about the Zodiac. The myth of the lone serial killer hunting in the shadows of the Bay Area is a Hollywood fever dream that has been spread by true crime authors looking for a bestseller and cops desperate for a cohesive narrative. The reality is much worse. The Zodiac was a collaborative fiction, showing that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are not the men holding the guns. Please subscribe to this channel at The Spooky Lawyer. If you'd like to support this channel, you could become a member of this channel. I appreciate you considering that. And please stay spooky.